Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. Coming up at 11:30 is The Power of Perseverance with Glenn Boehm. But right now is Ceasefire with Dale Adams and Ron Cisneros. The following is sponsored by the Boerne Bookshop, and this is Boerne Radio.
Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Boerne ISD trustee and owner of the Boerne Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Boerne City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros.
Welcome back to Ceasefire. My name is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And we're brought to you today by the Boerne Bookshop. And we have just finished up our 5-year anniversary down at the bookstore. So for those of you guys that have been coming out here all this time, we really appreciate it. And we're looking for another 5 years. Yep.
Really?
Yep. 5 years.
How did I not know that? I thought we were I thought the celebration the other day was like 2 years, not 5.
Black Friday 2019.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great, man. Congratulations.
Thank you. Okay. Today's show is going to be about a little more big picture. We're talking about the federal government and the 3 branches of the federal government and why we have them.
All right. This should be interesting.
Yes. So first off, what are the 3 branches?
The executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch.
Yes, and it hasn't always been that way, has it? Historically, if you go back through the thousands of years, it used to all be like the king, right? It was just he did everything.
That's right.
He was a multitasker, but for some reason we decided that we were going to split up certain powers.
And thankfully we did. Unfortunately, It seems more and more every day we keep trying to cobble them back together again.
Well, that's the natural impulse of any government, is to bring itself together and to consolidate. And so you have to always constantly be pushing back, saying, no, that belongs to that side and that belongs to the other side. So let's define the 3 branches. We've got the executive, which is the branch that does things, right?
That's the branch that executes the laws that are created by the legislative branch.
Okay.
Right?
So it can't make any decisions on its own, right? It has to just do what it's told, supposedly.
In theory, it's not supposed to.
Okay. And then next is the legislative branch, and what do?
They create the laws.
Okay, so they're the ones that supposedly analyze how these laws work and which ones will be good for us and which ones we need for society.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they're the people that we, the people, have access to. So we're not really bending the ear of the president. We're bending the ear of our local representative or senator and telling them, here's what we'd like. And then, in theory, they go and they make these laws according to our wills. And then the president and his staff execute those laws. They make them happen or make sure that they happen.
And which branch do we go to if, for some reason, the executive branch is doing something it's not supposed to do? Or the legislature passes a law that it shouldn't pass, that's contrary.
That would be the judicial branch.
Okay.
And if there's something that's left to interpretation, if there's something that's a little vague or unclear, they get to decide for us what that law said or did not say.
I'm not exactly a constitutional scholar, but I do think that back originally the judicial branch was not necessarily an afterthought, but they didn't consider it to have that much power, and it didn't until John Marshall be able to make proclamations on what was constitutional and what was not constitutional.
Right. I think they were the stepchild of government, like you said, an afterthought, and they've really developed into an equal branch. Sometimes the executive branch, they overstep their bounds a bit. We've seen that, and I think a lot of this stems from the legislative branch not asserting its authority sometimes. They abdicate some of their power to the executive branch.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That was one of the big issues I have with them, is that they don't actually look at any of the laws, and that there are a lot of laws out there that are created by the judicial or the executive branch that they never even see the light. Yeah.
Here's a quote. I want to jump in early and read this one because I like this, and this, I think, really gets to the heart of why it's important to have these separations. And this is an old quote. This is from a baron whose name, and I hope I don't butcher it, is Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755 was his lifespan. I don't know when he said this, but he wrote, "Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator.
Yeah, he did a lot of analyzing of how power structures worked. I think he's one of the great influencers of our founders, even though he never actually lived here. Yeah. Okay, here's a history question, and I should have done my research. How far back do you think the separation of powers go? Now, unfortunately, our audience can't call into us right now, but somebody's probably got an answer to that. But I'm thinking even in Roman times,
I think
but not necessarily Greek times, that the judiciary was separate in the
certainly,
Senate.
I think in Roman times, for sure, prior to the rise of Caesar, there was certainly a notion that power should be dispersed.
Yeah. And so this concept really goes back to early civilizations, and it's not just something recent that people came up with and said, oh, okay, this is how we're going to run our country. This is something that they gave a lot of thought to before they instituted it.
And rightfully so.
Yeah.
And I think we'll cover it throughout the show. We'll cover the reasons why it's important, why we need to get back to this.
And that sort of thing is, why do we have it that way? And I think Montesquieu mentioned that the executive branch will take over, basically.
So let's talk, you were talking about history. Let's talk about the history of this country a little bit and what might have motivated our founding fathers. We all know the story about the Boston Tea Party and no taxation without representation. That weighed heavily on their mind. And I think, and they were all very well-read, educated men that put the country together. And so going through the events that they were going through, it's easy to see why they wanted a government that really wasn't a monarchy, and wasn't strong in power. Yeah. And nowadays, for modern people, that can be inconvenient.
Yes, and that's the crux, is inconvenience of distributed power.
Right.
People that wield that power don't like that.
No, and the founding fathers wanted a slow government. Right. They wanted an inefficient government.
Most of them did.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Hamilton actually would have been happy with a consolidated government. I like him a lot, but he was one of pushing for more consolidation than the others. Yeah,
that's true.
It's interesting. I just want to point out before we move on, in the Declaration of Independence, a lot of these issues are laid out, such as arbitrary justice and things like that they were trying to address by the structure of the Constitution.
This is, speaking of arbitrary justice, there was a Supreme Court ruling, a month or two back, SEC versus, what was it, Jurinsky or something like that. I'm going to get it wrong, but it had to do with the administrative courts or tribunal courts that you see in a lot of executive branch agencies.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision basically said that you can't do that. Everybody gets a trial by jury, the right to a jury trial. You can't have these administrative courts within these agencies created by the executive branch that have their own rules.
Yeah.
And they come up with their own rulings that always favor the agency, the bureaucracy. And that's at the heart of what we're talking about here. On one hand, the people that advocate for that talk about the convenience of it, and one of the arguments that was made by more than one person. I've read several articles about this particular case, and there are people that are worried about fraud. Fraud's going to run rampant now because of this decision, and it's going to hurt the consumer. Tell that to the person that ends up in one of these tribunal courts against the EPA or against the SEC or against the FTC. Think about the power that you lose as a citizen. Think about the rights that you lose inside of one of these tribunal courts, these what has now been ruled unconstitutional. And I don't think we've even seen the full effect of it. We'll see it now with the SEC, but that ruling was almost limited to that particular agency.
Yeah, they wanted to go slow,
right,
in their dismantling process, and
right,
whether they're trying to do that or not. I think it's interesting that you bring up the agencies because that is part of the effort of government consolidating. Mm-hmm. President Wilson, I think he wrote a book or did a thesis or something along the lines of the administrative state. And what he set out to do was to create not necessarily a fourth branch, but a part of the executive that was the administrative part of government, and it would actually incorporate all three branches within it, because these agencies, they enact their rulings, they create their own rules. Currently, Congress will pass a law saying, okay, the EPA is going to take care of the environment. And then the EPA goes in and they make all the rules and the laws. And then the EPA has its own courts to administer those laws. So the EPA and the other agencies have all incorporated all three branches under one roof, which gets back to Montesquieu's issue of going too far. And so I think that's what we're seeing right now, or what we have seen over the last 100 years, is the development of this administrative state that's consolidating these powers. And now finally there's a little bit of a crack in there. And I think it's a good thing. I think we need to re-separate those powers.
I agree. If I may for a moment to do a little bunny trail here, I know we're talking about the federal government, but let's localize this a little bit and talk about separations of power at the local level. Mm-hmm. Do we have that? Do we need it? On the city side, I think I can tell you as a former councilman that you do have it. You have what's called a city council, city manager form of government. Basically, the city council is a policy-making board, and the city manager plays the role of the president, and the city council plays the role of the legislative branch, and the judicial branch would be the municipal court, but it's really not on the same level as the Supreme Court. It's a much smaller court.
Yeah, that's interesting, because looking back on my school board days, it's very similar in that we had the superintendent, which was the administrative part, and the board was the legislative part. We do board policy. But actually there wasn't a judicial branch. There was, if somebody had a complaint or some issue came up, it would go up through the administrative side, and then it would come to us, and we would adjudicate whatever the outcome was supposed to be. Now, they could appeal it to the state, but honestly, the first several steps of it were not part of a separate entity at all. That's interesting.
And on your side, so you were essentially the policy-making board in your role, part of that. You would say, okay, here's what the district is going to do, but then you handed everything over to the superintendent, who then went and executed your rules or your will.
Yeah, it's very separated in that respect. Yes.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because this will help people understand the city council role and the city manager role as well, and what should be the proper role at the federal level. There are rules that you had and that I had that kept us from talking to staff.
Oh, yeah.
So we could give an order, in my case to the city manager, in your case to the superintendent, and then it was his job to go and execute that order and direct staff. Now, tell us, or tell our audience, why you weren't allowed to talk to the staff.
Because we'd meddle. It'd meddle up, because our policies were made as a group, and when we don't necessarily always agree, but and even a given policy, we'll all have a slight different interpretation of what that policy should be. So when it goes to interpretation and execution, you need to have one view, and that's the superintendent's view who's taking it from us. If one of us decides to go and implement the policy on our own with some lower level, that's going to be a different interpretation. Even if it's slight, it'll be different.
Right.
And so you can't be having that. The executive side needs to have structure, leadership, and consistency. Now, the legislative side doesn't need that. And once in a while, it's helpful, but it doesn't necessarily need that to operate. Lots of voices are a good thing. But once you do the executive side, you need to have that leadership side and the single focus.
Yeah.
So you need that separation. That's why, and there's all kinds of different laws about who we can talk to and whatnot. And that never impeded us from going out and chatting with people and learning about what was going on out there and stuff like that. But giving orders was always left to the superintendent.
There's an old saying, too many chefs spoil the broth,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so on our side, and I certainly in 8 years, I saw a couple council members that had a difficult time understanding
Oh, yeah.
that, because you go in
you get
there,
passionate.
you're
Yeah.
running for something, and there's something that animates you. You get into office, and I'm going to do this, and then suddenly you see all these fences put around you, and all these laws from the state constitution down to the city charter that say actually you can't do that, and you have to stay in this little lane, and it tamps down your passions.
Which is a good thing.
It's a very good thing. And because what would happen if we didn't have those rules in place is that I could go to a staff member and say, listen, I want you to work on this. And meanwhile, another councilman comes in and says, I want you to be focused on that. And that staff member would never get anything done.
Yeah.
So we have to speak as one voice, as this policy-making board. And we might disagree, We might come to a 3-2 decision, but the ultimate agreement is that regardless of what that final count is, if it's a 4-1 vote or a 3-2 vote, that we're all going to respect that ultimate vote, and then we're going to take that vote and put it in the hands of the city manager and allow him, without interference, to execute that decision.
Yes, that's exactly what it's about. And I think your point of getting up there and being elected and suddenly thinking that you can control the world and change everything, that's an important stumbling block to the accumulation of power. And we all, when you go out there and get elected, it can be heady. It's a lot of work and stress, and suddenly you're elected and it's, wow, how did that happen? And you don't want it to go to your head. And this is one of the things that helps prevent that.
And on the executive branch side, what are some of those stumbling blocks that keep the president in check?
He's not allowed to do things, supposedly, that the legislator doesn't tell him what to do. Theoretically, the executive branch is just an automaton, just does what it's told. It's not like that in reality, but ideally it would be close to that. You don't want it completely like that because there has to be some sort of human input onto everything. But I don't know, you need to have, this is like the horse of the cart, when you need to have a rider that's telling it where to go, or else the horse will wander all over, just start eating grass.
And I think our presidents over the last 100 years have really developed a lot more power than they should have had.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said about our first president and his desire to not accumulate power, but to push it away from him.
Yes.
And I think we've gone in the wrong direction over the last 100 years, maybe longer, definitely longer, as I sit here and think about it.
I recently did Glenn Bame's show, and we talked about perseverance, and he asked me who I admired, and I talked about George Washington. I said, he's the one man in our history who walked up to the precipice of absolute power. They wanted him to be king. They wanted everything to revolve around him, and he could have had it all. And he stepped back from that and said, no, this is not what it's about. And I think that's one of the most incredible things in our history that was a huge turning point, that he stepped back from the brink of absolute power. He could have been another king.
Yeah, and he really understood his role as president.
Yes.
And I think today, and I'm not going to pick on any one side or the other because it's happening with all of the candidates. There's this idea, and I'm not just president, I'm talking about governors, I'm talking about city council people, this idea that I'm going to get in there and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, without ever considering what it is they cannot do and should not do.
Oh, that's never part of the equation. Don't tell me I can't do something. I can save everybody. I'm going to feed everybody. What is it? A chicken in every pot and a car in every driveway? Who was that? Truman? I don't remember who that was.
Truman, and I think Kinky Friedman was pot in every chicken.
He ran for governor once.
He did.
Yes, he did. I don't know if he got very far though.
I don't remember how many votes he got.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't even think he was a party candidate. I think he was independent.
Yeah, certainly.
Should have been on the debate stage. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here. This is Dale and Ron with Ceasefire, and we're talking about the three branches of government, and we'll come back in just a moment. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you're looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop. Welcome back to Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. We're talking about three branches of government, the federal government, and a couple things we're going to dig into a little bit deeper. But first, I want to start off with the book I brought in today, which is not necessarily about the three branches of government. It's called The 5,000-Year Leap, and it's a book on a variety of principles that our founders used when creating this country. And its premise basically is that all of these principles that we hold so dear go all the way back to 5,000 years, back to the Torah and various religious texts, Christian religious texts and Jewish religious texts. And it's fascinating because you can find all the lessons that we think we've learned in the last few hundred years right there. And it's very well put. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. We have it at the Boerne Bookshop. And I just found it pretty inspirational because it breaks things down into very concrete principles. An excellent book on the fundamental philosophies behind the creation of our government.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
It's very good. You haven't read it?
I haven't.
Oh, you need to read that. You'd like it.
I'm going to put that in my stack of 100 books that I need to get to.
Yeah, 6 foot stack there.
Yeah, it's getting taller.
Yeah.
I've actually run out of space on my bookshelves thanks to the bookshop. I now have books on the floor.
Oh, that's not a good sign.
Kathy hasn't noticed them yet, so I'm okay.
Okay, that's good.
So, Dale, let's talk about the dangers of when the branches come out of line or get out of their lane. And let's start with the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court stops being just a judicial court, when they start legislating, what are the dangers there?
For starters, you have people that nobody has vetted or checked for whether their view on society is consistent with what our society needs or what the people want, or even matches anything. They're basically vetted on, are they fair and balanced, and will they execute or call the sides?
Uphold the Constitution? Is that the word?
Uphold the Constitution,
yeah.
Yes. And when they start getting out of their lane, you never know where it's going to go. Yeah.
So we don't elect them. They're appointed.
Yeah.
They have lifetime terms. They have no term limits.
Yeah.
And so when they start to legislate, what we have are 9 unaccountable. And so going back to the convenience thing that we talked about, there are times when it's convenient for us politically, if our side has the majority on the court, it's convenient for us to have them there legislating.
Oh, yeah.
And we never think about, or seldom do we think about, what would happen if that changes. And I think, and not to call out one side or another, but I think that's something, the terror that Democrats are realizing now is that they had the majority, they lost the majority, and now
they're panicking. Yeah.
And they see things that they're going to call it legislating. I would say, no, in my opinion, no, the Supreme Court's kind of going in the right direction. But they're going to call it legislating. But they didn't have a problem when they had the majority. And again, not calling out one side or another, because our side can do it too.
Yeah.
And so what are the dangers when the executive branch does the same thing, when they come out of their lane and they start to legislate?
I think we've already seen that with the agencies. You get rules that nobody has vetted, that nobody even knows about. Does anybody in the world understand what all the IRS rules are? I don't think so. And there's no way to actually complete an IRS form, your taxes, and be correct 100% of the time. Somebody could find something wrong with it.
Yeah.
So you get inconsistencies. You don't get any oversight of what's happening, because they're the ones that decide how to do it, and they're the ones that do it, and they're the ones that decide if it was done right.
Right.
Of course it was done right. And so we see a lot of that, I think, in our agencies now.
Yeah. And I think the obvious danger on the legislative branch when they overstep their lane, and really, I don't know that they can
I don't think they overstep.
They don't overstep. What happens
Abdicate.
is they abdicate. Yeah, they understep. Yes. They don't, and I don't know why they do this, write laws, and then they just leave it up to the judiciary to figure it out, or to the executive branch to enact it in ways that they never imagined.
Yeah, that's been going on. And honestly, I tie a lot of this back to the administrative state that Wilson started, and even it even started before him. I think he just defined it a little bit. In that, having all this rabble get together and try and decide on laws, it's just a waste of time. Right. And honestly, our politicians on the legislative side are just elected by regular people who don't understand the importance of having the right people there. And so over time, people have just, or the government, the executive side has just said, we'll take care of that. Don't you worry about it. We'll figure out how to make it work, because we know we're professionals. We've been doing this for decades, and we know exactly how that law should be enacted and enforced. And honestly, a lot of politicians go in there and they're so heady and they think it's all so wonderful, and they're having a great party and socialize and meeting people, impressed by all the famous people they're meeting, that they just slip away from the whole responsibility of reading the laws and enacting the ones that are good. So I think on their side, the executive branch is happily saying, yeah, we'll take care of it. But at the same time, I think the people there have developed a culture of we're having a good time. And maybe now there's more hostility now maybe than there was 20 years ago, but they're still going there to do theater, even if it's negative theater. There seems to be a lot of that.
Well, that's a great conversation. I think we could do another show just on the state level.
Are we running out? Okay.
I think we're out of time, but tell us that book again.
Okay, it's The 5,000-Year Leap. It's written, doesn't have an author on here actually. It's written by Principles of Freedom 101, which was the group that did it. There's an author here somewhere. I don't know who the author is. Cleon Skosin. And it's a great book. Got it at the Boerne Bookshop. So stop on by. And if you missed any of our show, you can go into Boerne Radio and check out our podcast and check out our past episodes. And we'll see you next week.
Have a good weekend.
Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop. We pride ourselves on finding what you're looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop.
Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. Now let's head over to the Patrick Heath Public Library with Miss Constance for Children's Story Time. As the Patrick Heath Library is open today from 10 to 4, this is Boerne Radio.